The town looks empty. White sheets hang from the shattered windows. The guns have gone quiet, and word has come down the line that the enemy is finished, that this war has only days left to run. You walk up the rubble-choked street with your rifle slung on your shoulder, thinking of home for the first time in months, letting yourself believe that you might actually live to see it. And then, a single shot cracks from a cellar window. And the man beside you, a soldier who lived through the beaches and the winter and a full year of everything this war could throw at him, falls dead in the street of a country that has already lost. The war is almost over. That is exactly what makes this the most dangerous time of all. Out here in these final weeks, death has grown desperate, and it is in no mood to let anyone go home clean. Welcome to the strange and cruel last chapter of the war against the German dictator, to the final push into the heart of a collapsing empire that is beaten, that knows it is beaten, and that refuses, even so, to stop killing. In the natural world, the most dangerous moment of any hunt often comes at the end, when the cornered creature with nothing left to lose turns and fights with everything it has. That is the animal you are hunting now. A regime in its death throes, lashing out in every direction, ready to spend its last soldiers, its old men, its children, anyone it can drive into the fight, rather than admit the end has come. You are a young man who has come a long and bloody way to reach this ground, and now, with the finish line in sight, you must survive the most unpredictable killing season of the entire war. Out here, you are the specimen. And a dying beast is the most dangerous beast of all. Over the next hour, we are going to study this final chapter, the way a naturalist studies the last wild moments of a cornered animal. We will study the great river that stands between you and the enemy heartland. We will study the ruined cities where the fighting goes room by room. We will study the strange and terrible mix of enemies you now face, from hardened fanatics to frightened boys. And we will study the deepest wound of all, the things you will find behind the gates of this dying empire, things no training could ever prepare you for. By the end, you will understand why you would not survive. But first, do one small thing. Tap subscribe, because the men who lived through this are nearly gone now, and keeping the memory of what they walked into is the whole reason we are here. Let us begin with the cruelest thing about this final chapter, which is not a weapon at all. It is the timing. Every man in the line knows the war is nearly won. He can feel it, see it in the endless columns of prisoners, hear it in the rumors that race up and down the front. And that knowledge, which should be a comfort, becomes instead a special kind of torment. Because now, for the first time, a man can truly picture going home. He can see the front porch, the family, the ordinary life waiting on the far side of this. And that makes every remaining day unbearable, because to die now, in the last week, in the last hour, after surviving everything, would be the cruelest joke the war could play. Men who had been fearless for years grew cautious in those final days, hollow-eyed with the dread of falling at the very end. There is a particular terror in being the one who almost made it, and it hangs over this whole final push. In the natural world, the animal that has survived 100 crossings is no safer at the last one than the one crossing for the first time. The river does not remember. The war does not remember. It does not care that you have bled for it for years, that you have earned your way home a dozen times over. The last bullet fired in anger is just as deadly as the first, and someone has to be the last to catch it. Every man on that front was doing the terrible arithmetic in his head, counting the days that might be left in the war and praying his own number did not come up in the final few. Now let us look at the enemy you face in these last weeks, because he is not one enemy but many, and you never know which one is waiting in the next building. The old disciplined army you fought across France is shattered now, its best men dead or captured, and what remains is a strange and unpredictable mixture. In one cellar you might find a boy of 16, terrified, barely able to lift his weapon. In the next, a hardened fanatic who will fight to the last breath and take you with him if he can. You cannot tell which is which until the shooting starts. And that uncertainty is its own kind of danger, because you cannot know whether the white flag ahead is a true surrender or a trap, whether the figure in the window is a frightened child or a killer. The dying regime, running out of soldiers, has reached deep into its own people to find more, And this is one of the saddest and strangest dangers of the final push. Old men, far past fighting age, and boys who should be in a schoolroom have been handed weapons and pushed into the path of your advance, told to defend the rubble to the death. Some of them throw down their arms at the first chance. Others, filled with the poison the regime has fed them their whole young lives, fight with a reckless fury that makes them deadly. To face a child with a weapon that can kill you is a horror that stays with a man forever, because whatever choice he makes in that instant, he loses a piece of himself. The regime did not care whom it fed into the fire at the end. It only cared that the fire kept burning. And mixed in among the boys and the old men are the true fanatics, the hardcore who will not surrender under any circumstances. And they are perhaps the most dangerous men left on the battlefield. They have tied their fate to the dictators, and they know there is no future for them in a world where he has lost. So they fight with the desperation of the doomed. Worse, they turn their cruelty on their own people. In the final days, deserters and men who tried to give up were hanged in the town squares as warnings, left dangling with signs around their necks, killed by their own side for the crime of wanting to live. To fight an enemy that murders its own soldiers to keep the rest in the fight is to understand that you are facing something that has lost every last shred of reason, and a foe without reason is a foe you cannot predict. Even before the great river, there is a wall to break through. A belt of concrete and steel the enemy spent years building along his frontier. Rows of squat concrete teeth rise from the ground to stop your tanks. Backed by minefields, wire ditches, and hundreds of low concrete bunkers, each sited to cover the others, each a small fortress in its own right. To break this line, you must advance across open, prepared ground, swept by interlocking fire, find the gaps, and take the bunkers one by one. It is slow, grinding, deadly work, the kind that fills the aid stations for every mile of ground gained, and it stands between you and the river before the real push into the heartland can even begin. And each of those bunkers has to be taken the hardest way there is. A low concrete box set into a hillside, its firing slit sweeping the only ground you can cross, cannot be wished away or gone around. Someone has to cross that open, mined ground under fire, work in close to the slit, and finish it at arm's length. It is among the most dangerous jobs this war offers, and the men who did it knew the odds as they rose to run. To attack a fixed gun in its concrete is to accept that you will be the most exposed creature on the field for the length of that run, with everything the bunker line has pointed at the very ground you must cross. Before you can even reach the heart of this dying empire, you must cross its last great barrier, a wide and famous river that has guarded the German heartland for centuries. The enemy knows its value and has blown the bridges behind him, so to get across you must go over open water in small boats, or over whatever crossing the engineers can throw up under fire in full view, slow and exposed, while the far bank does everything in its power to stop you. A river crossing against a defended shore is among the deadliest things an army can attempt, because for those long minutes on the water, there is no cover at all. Nowhere to hide, nothing to do but keep moving toward the far side and pray. Men who had survived years of war died in that cold water within sight of the enemy homeland, so close to the end, and yet stopped at the river's edge. The enemy meant to blow every bridge across that river and leave you stranded on the wrong bank, and for the most part he did. But at one place, through a mix of luck and speed and raw nerve, your men reached a railway bridge and rushed across it before the charges meant to drop. It could finish the job, seizing a foothold on the far bank that the enemy had sworn you would never have. He threw everything he had at that crossing to destroy it and the men on it, days of shelling and desperate attacks, because he understood what it meant. A single bridge taken intact, held against everything, opened the door to the heartland, and the men who took it and held it did something that shortened the war and saved countless lives at a price paid in full on that span. And to force the river in strength, thousands of men once again dropped from the sky, floating down in daylight into the fire of a waiting enemy on the far bank. For the paratroopers and the glider men, the crossing meant descending slowly through flak and small arms fire, exposed in the open air, unable to shoot back, landing among an enemy who was ready and waiting. Those first minutes on the ground, scattered, sometimes alone, gathering into fighting groups under fire, were as dangerous as any in the war. To come down out of the sky into the enemy's guns, in the war's last weeks, took a particular kind of courage, and many good men were lost in the air and on the landing grounds so that the river line could be broken for good. Suppose you get across, now you are fighting in the cities, and the cities have been reduced to something out of a nightmare. Months and years of bombing have turned whole towns to seas of rubble, mountains of broken brick and twisted steel where streets used to be, and the enemy fights from within that ruin. Every pile of rubble is a fortress, every cellar is a bunker, every shattered upper floor is a sniper's nest. You clear these ruins the way you would clear any deadly maze, one room, one cellar, one heap of broken stone at a time, never knowing what waits on the far side of the next wall. There is no open ground to read here, no clear line of advance. There is only the next ruin, and the awful question of who is inside it. And in that rubble waits a weapon that has changed what it means to be a soldier in a city, because it means that anyone, anywhere, can destroy a tank. The enemy has produced great numbers of a cheap, simple, one-shot weapon that a single man can carry and fire, and that can punch through the armor of your heaviest vehicles at close range. It takes almost no training to use, and so a lone boy hiding in the rubble, a single old man in a doorway, can knock out a tank and the men riding on it in the space of a heartbeat. The armored vehicles that were meant to protect you and lead the way become death traps in the close confines of the ruins, and every window, every pile of brick, every dark doorway might hide the one shot that ends you. The city has become a place where the smallest, weakest-looking figure can be the deadliest. In the ruined cities, the fight often went underground, into the cellars, because that is where the people and the last defenders sheltered from the endless bombing. To clear a building, you had to go down into those dark, crowded basements, never knowing whether you would find terrified civilians huddled in the black, or armed men waiting in ambush, or both together. A grenade tossed down a cellar stair could kill the innocent as easily as the enemy, and the split-second choices forced on you in those dark stairwells were the kind that could haunt a man forever. The cellars were a world of their own beneath the rubble, and every dark opening leading down into one was a question you had to answer with your life on the line. And the snipers held the high ground of the ruins, the church towers and the standing upper floors that looked down over the shattered streets. A single good marksman in a steeple could freeze a whole advance, make every crossing and every open stretch a place where death waited, force grown men to crawl and dash and cower in a town that was supposedly already taken. He was in no hurry. He wanted one man and then another, and to make the price of every careless step a life. Like the patient ambush hunter of the wild, he traded in stillness and position, and he asked only that you show yourself for a single careless second in his field of view. The enemy also turned his great anti-aircraft guns down from the sky and onto you, and they were murderous in that role. Built to reach aircraft miles overhead, these high-velocity guns could destroy a tank at a great distance and tear apart infantry in the open, their shells arriving faster than the sound that would have warned of them. Rings of these guns defended the cities and the key crossings, and to advance against them was to move under fire from weapons that outranged almost anything you had. A single, well-placed gun could hold up an advance and litter the approaches with wrecked vehicles, and there was little to do but work around it, wear it down, and pay the price of getting close. And the enemy still had teeth in the form of his last heavy tanks, monsters of thick armor and powerful guns that, even in ones and twos, could dominate a street or a stretch of road. Hidden in the rubble or dug in at a crossroads, a single one of them could knock out your lighter tanks before they ever landed a hit, and clearing it out meant a deadly game of maneuver through the ruins, trying to get a shot into its flank before its gun found you. There were few of them left by the end, but each one was a small fortress on tracks, and the men who had to face them knew that in a straight fight, the odds did not favor the vehicles on their own side, and there was no true rest even in the towns you had taken, because a captured town in these final weeks was never fully safe. At night, the danger crept back. A fanatic returning through the rubble, a hidden holdout who had waited for dark, a secret fighter slipping in from the countryside. You slept, when you slept, with one ear open and your weapon close, in a strange ruined house in an enemy land, never certain that the ground beneath you was truly yours. The line between the front and the rear had blurred into nothing, and the war could reach out and touch you in a town you had walked through in daylight without a shot, so the vigilance never ended. day or night. And through all of it, moved the ordinary people of that broken land, caught between the retreating fanatics and your advancing guns, sheltering in the same cellars the last defenders used, dying in the same rubble. Most of them wanted only for the nightmare to end, and they suffered terribly in these final weeks, their cities in ruins, their world collapsing, the war grinding through their homes. For the soldier, their presence added yet another weight, the constant need to tell the harmless from the hostile in an instant, the knowledge that the fighting in these ruins was killing the innocent alongside the guilty. It was a grim and heartbreaking backdrop to the final push, and it marked the men who moved through it. And the shelling never fully stopped right to the end. Even a collapsing army had guns, and it used them, dropping fire onto the crossings and the roads and the ruins where your men had to go. You could be doing everything right, moving carefully, taking cover, and still the shells could find you, because artillery does not need to see a man to kill him. To endure that in the final weeks, knowing the war was nearly won, was its own particular strain. The thunder still falling out of the sky when every instinct told you the killing should already have stopped. It was one more reminder that the war was not over until it was over, and that the guns did not know or care how close the end had come. The ruins are seeded with traps as surely as they are haunted by snipers. A door that opens too easily, a tempting object left in plain sight, a body that should not be disturbed. Any of them might be wired to explode the moment a tired, curious young man reaches out. Mines wait beneath the rubble, and in the roads the enemy knew you would have to use. As the enemy pulls back, he leaves these patient little killers behind him, so that even the ground you have already taken, the town you have already cleared, is never truly safe. You learn to trust nothing, to touch nothing, to move through these broken places as though everything in them is a snare, because much of it is, and that endless suspicion wears a man down as surely as any battle. And there is a fear that follows you even into the areas you thought were conquered, the fear of the enemy who does not wear a uniform. The dying regime has called on its people to keep fighting even after the soldiers are gone, to become secret fighters who strike from the shadows and melt back into the population. So a sniper might fire from a house in a town that surrendered yesterday. An ambush might wait on a quiet road miles behind the front. A civilian who smiles at you in the daylight might be the one who cuts a throat in the dark. Most of the population wanted nothing more than for the killing to end, but you could never be sure which face hid a last, fanatical enemy. And that uncertainty made even the calm moments tense, and even the safe towns dangerous. The collapse itself became a danger, because the front dissolved into chaos, and in chaos it is hard to tell friend from foe or fighter from surrenderer. In a single day you might take thousands of prisoners, whole units giving up at once, exhausted men throwing down their arms with relief, and in the same day, on the same road, run into a pocket of fanatics determined to fight to the death. The masses of surrendering enemy, the streams of refugees, the confusion of a broken army, all of it made a fog through which death could still reach you at any moment. To lower your guard among the surrendering thousands was to risk the one man among them who had not surrendered at all, and the strain of staying alert through all that chaos never let up. And the surrenders themselves became a danger, because in the chaos you could not always trust the white flag. Most who raised it meant it, worn-out men desperate for the war to end. But now and then, the flag was a lie, a way to draw your men into the open before a hidden gun opened up, or a true surrender by some, while others nearby fought on. So you learned to approach even the men giving up with your finger near the trigger, and your eyes scanning the windows, because the one time you let your guard down among the surrendering might be the time it cost you everything. To have to suspect even a man's plea for mercy is a hard, cold way to live, and the final weeks forced it on you again and again. The roads of this collapsing empire were choked with the human tide the war had uprooted. Refugees fleeing the fighting, columns of prisoners, and above all the vast numbers of people the regime had dragged from across the continent to work as slaves, now suddenly freed and wandering the roads by the hundreds of thousands, hungry, lost, searching for a way home. This flood of desperate humanity filled the routes your army needed to advance, made every column crawl, and turned the simple act of moving forward into a slow passage through a sea of suffering. It slowed you, it broke your heart, and it added confusion to a front that was already dissolving into chaos. One more strange danger of a war coming apart at the seams. And sometimes, as you pushed forward, you came upon your own, the men taken prisoner in earlier battles, held for months or years behind the enemy's lines, now freed as your advance overran the camps that held them. To find them, thin and worn but alive, was one of the few pure joys of the final push, a reminder of what all the fighting was for. But reaching them in time meant driving hard and fast into uncertain ground, sometimes racing to free a camp before the retreating enemy could move or harm the men inside. Those rescues carried their own risks, deep drives into the collapsing enemy rear. But they were among the things the men who made them remembered with something other than pain. The regime, in its final madness, called on fanatics to keep fighting as secret killers even after the surrender, and these hidden fighters had their own cruel tricks. One of the ugliest was a wire strung tight across a road at the height of a man's neck, meant to catch the drivers and riders of your open vehicles as they sped along, an invisible trap that could kill in an instant. So your men learned to fix upright cutting bars to the front of their jeeps and to watch the empty roads for the glint of a wire, because even a quiet stretch of countryside behind the front could hide a killer who wanted only to take one more life for a cause already lost. The war would not fully let go, even of the roads you thought you owned, and the collapse of the enemy's world brought a lawless chaos that was dangerous in its own right. As the government and the police and the order of a whole society fell apart, the countryside filled with armed stragglers, desperate men, and the plain breakdown of all the rules that normally keep violence in check. You were moving through a land where authority had dissolved, where anything could happen and often did, where the danger came not only from organized enemy units, but from the sheer disorder of an empire falling to pieces around you. To pass through a society in total collapse is to move through a place where the normal certainties are gone, and where a soldier can never quite predict where the next threat will come from. When the enemy's lines finally broke for good, the advance became a headlong race across the country, mile after mile eaten up in a day, columns of tanks and trucks pouring deep into the heartland. It felt like winning, and in a way it was, but speed brought its own dangers. You could outrun your own supply and your own support, drive bypast pockets of enemy who were still very much willing to fight, find yourself deep in hostile country with your flanks in the air. The faster you went, the more the neat picture of the front dissolved into a scattered, unpredictable thing, and a column racing ahead could round a bend straight into a fight it never saw coming. Victory had a momentum of its own, and that momentum could carry you into danger as easily as toward home. And the fast advance carried its own dangers, because when an army races forward across a collapsing front, the neat lines on the map blur, and the risk of being struck by your own side climbs. Columns moving quickly could run into one another in the confusion. Aircraft could mistake a friendly column for the enemy. Artillery could fall on positions that had moved faster than the map could keep up. In the smoke and speed and disorder of those final weeks, men died under fire from their own side, killed by the very weapons meant to protect them. Victims of a front moving too fast for anyone to fully track. It is one of the ugliest truths of a war ending in chaos that the confusion itself becomes a killer. And then, as you push deeper into this dying empire, you come upon the thing that no soldier was prepared for, the thing that would mark every man who saw it for the rest of his life. Behind fences and gates, in camps, the regime had tried to keep hidden. Your advancing men found human suffering on a scale that broke something inside them, evidence of a cruelty so vast and so deliberate that hardened soldiers, men who had seen years of war, wept and were sick and could not speak. There are no words here that can hold what they found, and it is not for us to try to describe it. It is enough to say that the men who opened those gates carried what they saw for the rest of their days, and that it changed forever how they understood what they had been fighting against. Whatever doubts a man might have had about why he was there ended at those gates. That discovery did something to the men beyond the horror of the moment, because it gave a terrible clarity to everything that had come before. The beaches, the hedgerows, the winter, the ruined cities, all the friends lost along the way, all of it took on a new and heavier meaning in the light of what those camps revealed. The men understood, in a way no speech could ever have taught them, exactly what kind of thing they had crossed an ocean to destroy. It steeled some of them. and it haunted all of them. And it is one of the reasons the men of this war carried what they carried so quietly for so long. Some things a person sees cannot be unseen and cannot be spoken of easily, and can only be lived with, one quiet day at a time for a lifetime. Through all of this, your body is worn down to almost nothing, because the final push, for all that the end is near, offers no rest. The advance is fast and relentless, the days long, the sleep snatched in ruined buildings and roadside ditches, the food eaten cold and on the move. You have been at this for a very long time by now, and the exhaustion has settled into your bones and will not lift. A tired man makes the small mistakes that get him killed, and in these final weeks, when caution matters more than ever, you are more tired than you have ever been. The war is asking you to be at your sharpest at the exact moment your body has the least left to give, and that gap is one more danger in a chapter already full of them. And you carry the weight of the friends you lose, made heavier by how close the end has come. To lose a man in the first year is a terrible thing. To lose him in the last week, with the war all but over, with home so near you can almost touch it, is a grief with a special sting to it, an unfairness so sharp it can hardly be borne. The men who fell in those final days had come so far, survived so much, earned their way home so many times over, and the war took them anyway, at the very end, for nothing. Those losses were the hardest of all to accept, and the men who lived carried the names of the friends who fell at the finish line for the rest of their lives, along with the quiet, unanswerable question of why it had been them and not you. And still the replacements came. New men fed into the line even in the war's last weeks, and their fate was the cruelest of all. Imagine reaching the front as a green young man in the final days, before you have learned a single one of the tricks that keep a soldier alive, only to fall in one of the last fights of a war that was already won. Men who had been in the country for days, who had not yet fired their weapon in anger, died in those final weeks alongside veterans who had survived for years. The war took the newest and the oldest without distinction, right up to the end. And there was a special sorrow in the loss of a man who had come so far, only to fall before he ever truly began. By now the strain has worn deep grooves in every man who has lasted, and the mind, like the body, can only take so much. Some men, after months and years of it, reached a point where they simply could not go on, where the fear and the noise and the endless loss finally overwhelmed whatever had held them together. It was not weakness, whatever anyone said. It was the plain limit of what a person can endure, and the final push coming after everything else drove many good men past it. To be so close to the end, and to feel your own nerve giving way after it had carried you so far, was its own quiet agony, one that many of these men fought in silence right up to the last day. And do not imagine that because the end was near, the dying had slowed. The final months of the war against the German dictator were among the costliest, with men falling by the thousands even as the enemy collapsed, because a cornered empire fighting for every ruin and every river exacts a terrible price on the way down. For the man in the line, the odds of falling in those last weeks were real and constant, and everyone knew it. You were not one man walking safely toward a finish line. You were one more figure in a fight that kept killing at nearly full fury right up until the moment it stopped. And the closer the end came, the more unbearable each of those losses was to those who had to keep going. The enemy did everything he could to slow your advance, and the roads told the story. Trees felled across the route, craters blown in the road, rubble piled into barriers, all of it covered by a gun or a handful of determined men, so that every mile had to be cleared before it could be crossed. A single roadblock, well placed and well defended, could hold up a whole column for hours, and the men sent forward to clear it paid the price while the vehicles waited behind. It was a slow, grinding way to advance, foot by foot against an enemy determined to make you fight for every yard, even as his world came apart around him, and it wore at the patience and the nerve of everyone in that crawling column. And the season itself gave you no comfort, because the final push came through the last of a hard winter and a cold, wet, early spring, through mud and rain and chill, sleeping rough in ruined buildings and flooded fields. The supplies had to be hauled forward over long, damaged roads, and when they fell behind, as they did, the men went hungry and cold at the front. You had been at this a long time by now, worn thin, and the raw weather of those final months pressed down on top of everything else. One more hardship in a chapter already stacked high with them, one more thing to endure on the long, cold road to the end. And even the sky, which by now belonged almost entirely to your side, still held the occasional nasty surprise, because the dying regime had produced a handful of new aircraft faster than anything that had flown before. Now and then, one of them would streak out of nowhere, far quicker than your own planes could answer, strike at a column or a bridge, and be gone before the guns could track it. There were too few of them, and they came too late to change the war, but for the men on the ground who felt one tear passed overhead, it was a reminder that the enemy, even in his last days, was still capable of dangerous surprises, and that nothing about this final chapter could be taken for granted. And here and there you ran into a knot of men who had decided to die where they stood, and taking that ground from them was as hard as anything in the whole war. A bridge, a barracks, a fortified town held by fanatics who would not yield, who had to be beaten almost to the last man before the position fell. Cost your side dearly for objectives that, in the larger picture, everyone knew were already lost. To have to fight to the death for a patch of ground against an enemy who wanted nothing but to take you with him, in the final days of a one war, was a bitter and costly business, and it fell to your men to do it anyway, because the ground had to be taken, and there was no other way to take it. There is an ugliness to the fighting at the end that is hard to speak of, because as the war ground toward its close, the rules that were supposed to govern it frayed on every side. In the rage and exhaustion of the final weeks, with fanatics fighting from the rubble and friends falling in a war already won, mercy was not always given by anyone. Prisoners were not always taken. Men worn past the edge of their endurance did hard things and had hard things done to them. It is not a comfortable truth, but it is a true one, that the end of a long and brutal war is often its cruelest stretch, when the fury of years boils over and the line between soldier and something darker grows thin. To survive that and stay yourself through it was its own kind of battle. So let us finally answer the question we began with. Why wouldn't you survive here in the last chapter, with the war all but won? Not because you are weak, and not because you lack courage. You would not survive because a dying empire is the most dangerous kind, lashing out with everything it has left, fighting from the rubble with a weapon in every window, defending its last river with desperation, throwing its old men and its children and its fanatics into your path, murdering its own to keep the fight alive, and seeding the ground you take with patient traps. And over all of it hangs the cruelest weight of all, the knowledge that the end is near, that to fall now is to fall for nothing, and that someone on this front in these final days has to be the last to die. And yet, here is the part that should stay with you longest. Men did survive. Not because the odds spared them, but because they endured what should not have been endurable, right to the very end. They crossed the last river under fire. They cleared the ruined cities one deadly room at a time. They faced the boys and the old men and the fanatics and made the impossible choices that came with them. They opened the gates of that dying empire and looked upon the worst that human beings have ever done to one another, and they did not turn away. They carried their friends who fell at the finish line, and they walked the last miles to the end of the deadliest war in history. When you weigh what this final chapter threw at them, the wonder is not how many were lost so close to the end. The wonder is that any of them made it home at all. That is why these stories matter, and that is why we tell them here. The men who lived this are old now, and their number grows smaller every single year, and each of them carried the last chapter of that war home inside him, the friends lost at the finish line, the things seen behind those gates in ways most of us will never have to imagine. The least we can do is remember what they walked into on our behalf, right up to the final day. So if this took you somewhere you have never been, and let you feel even a fraction of the weight those young men carried, then do one thing before you go. Subscribe, so the next story finds you, and share this with someone who still remembers. A story that is remembered is a life that is honored, and these are lives that deserve to be honored for as long as there is anyone left to listen. And then, one day, it simply stops. The guns fall silent. The word comes down that it is over, that the German dictator and his empire are finished at last, and you are still standing. You have crossed the river, cleared the cities, survived the desperate last weeks when the dying beast was at its most dangerous. Around you, other men are cheering or weeping, or simply sitting down in the sudden quiet, unable to believe they have lived to see it. You think of the friends who did not, the ones who fell in the last days, so close to this moment they could almost have touched it, and you understand, standing there in the strange new silence, that you have survived something that should not have been survivable, and that you will carry every mile of it for the rest of your life. The war against the German dictator is over. And out here, in this quiet, still breathing, still standing, that is as close to a victory as anyone gets. You have crossed the great river. You have fought your way through the first of the ruined cities and lived to tell it. And now you stand at the edge of something vast, because the dying empire stretches on for hundreds of miles ahead of you, city after city, river after river, forest after forest, and every mile of it must be taken. In the first part of this story, we watched the beaten enemy turn and fight from the rubble. Now we go deeper, into the long, grinding heart of the final push, where the war kept finding new ways to kill a young man who had almost made it home. Because the beast was cornered, yes. But a cornered beast this size takes a long time to die, and it kills all the way down. Once the river line was broken, the war changed its pace, and the change brought its own dangers. Long columns of tanks and armored vehicles were unleashed to race deep into the enemy's heartland, driving hard and fast to seize ground before the defenders could form a new line. If you rode with those spearheads, you were the very tip of the advance, the first to reach every town, every crossroads, every ambush, far ahead of the main body and often out on your own. In the natural world, the creature that ranges farthest ahead of the herd sees the most and is exposed to the most, and so it was here. To ride the point of the armored thrust was to be the first to find whatever the enemy had left, waiting on the road ahead. And the men who crewed those tanks fought a strange and dangerous war of their own. Sealed inside a steel box, seeing the world through narrow slits, they rolled into towns and down roads where a single hidden gun or a lone man with the right weapon could turn their machine into a burning trap in an instant. The tank that looked so powerful in the open field became terribly vulnerable in the close country of the final push, in the streets and the woods and the sunken lanes where the enemy could get near before he was seen. A crew that survived a hit had seconds to escape a machine that was filling with fire and smoke, and the men who rode inside them lived with that knowledge every mile of the advance. And the infantry rode into battle clinging to the outside of those same tanks, which was its own particular gamble. Perched on the hull with nothing between you and the enemy but open air, you moved faster than your legs could ever carry you. But you were utterly exposed, and the tank you rode was the thing every enemy gun most wanted to hit. When the firing started, you had to throw yourself off and find cover in the same instant, because to stay on a tank, drawing fire was to invite the burst meant for it. The bond between the men on foot and the machines they rode was close and deadly, each protecting the other, each drawing danger onto the other, all the way across the country. Behind every fast advance came the men who made it possible, and few faced more danger for less glory than the engineers. Every river had to be bridged, every minefield cleared, every roadblock removed, and it was the engineers who did that work, often under fire, often first, often in the open where the enemy could see them. When a column reached a blown bridge, the advance halted until these men could throw a new span across, laboring on the water and the banks, while the far side did everything it could to stop them. In an advance measured in miles a day, the whole army waited on the courage of the men who cleared the path, and they paid for every crossing and every cleared road in a currency the rest of the army rarely saw. And the ground those engineers cleared was sown with patient, hidden killers. There were mines built to break a tank, heavy charges buried in the roads, and mines built for men, small and cheap and scattered by the thousand. The cruelest of them were made largely of wood, so that the detectors sweeping for metal passed right over them, and they lay in wait to take a foot or a leg from any man who stepped wrong. To advance across ground you knew was mined, unable to trust the detectors, watching every step, was a slow torture of the nerves. In the wild, the buried trap is among the oldest and most effective of hunting tools, and here it had been perfected and scattered across every field and road the enemy thought you might use. And the great river was only the first of many. The interior of the dying empire was laced with rivers and canals, and the enemy fought to hold each one, blowing the bridges and defending the far banks, so that the advance became a series of crossings, each one its own small, deadly battle. Again and again you came to the water's edge, and again you had to force your way over, exposed on boats or hasty bridges while the far shore poured fire into you. A man might survive one river crossing only to face another a week later, and another after that, each one a fresh chance for the war to take him. The land itself, cut through with water, kept setting the same deadly obstacle in your path over and over. Now let us look at one of the strangest and most dangerous episodes of the whole final push, the Great Encirclement. As the advance drove forward, huge numbers of the enemy were caught in a vast pocket, hundreds of thousands of men trapped inside a ring. Your army had thrown around an entire industrial region. It sounds like a clean victory, and in the end it was, but reducing that pocket was deadly work. A trapped army is a desperate army, and this one still had weapons and fight left in it, and it lashed out in every direction trying to break free. To squeeze that pocket shut, the men had to fight through a dense, built-up region against an enemy with nowhere to run and nothing to lose, and the fighting was fierce right up until the mass surrender that finally came. And the enemy's automatic weapons still ruled the ruins, as deadly in the final weeks as they had ever been. His fast-firing machine guns, set up in the rubble and the windows, could sweep a street with a solid wall of fire and cut down anyone caught in the open. To advance in the cities meant working forward in short rushes, one man moving while others fired to keep the enemy's head down, darting from cover to cover across streets that a single gun could turn into a death zone. It only took one well-placed weapon to stop a whole advance cold and pile up the men who tried to cross its field of fire. In that ruined country, the gunner in the rubble was a predator as deadly as any in this war, and death often came from above in the streets, dropped by an enemy you could not see, because the mortar was everywhere in that fighting. These weapons lobbed their shells in a high arc over the walls, and the rubble to fall straight down onto the men below, which meant that cover which stopped a bullet gave no protection at all from a shell dropping out of the sky. You could be pressed against a solid wall, safe from anything fired flat, and still a mortar round could come down beside you. The enemy hid these weapons behind the ruins, out of sight, and rained fire onto the streets and yards where your men had to move, and there was rarely anything to shoot back at, only the sky and the whistle and the burst. In the cities, the enemy had also built great towers of concrete, huge fortified blocks bristling with guns, so strong that even heavy shellfire could barely mark them. These strongpoints anchored the defense of the cities, and they could not be easily destroyed or bypassed, so they had to be surrounded and reduced the hard way, at close range over days. To attack such a fortress, its walls immune to your guns, its defenders firing down on every approach, was among the grimmest tasks of the urban fighting, and it fell to the infantry to do it. Working close under those towering concrete walls while the guns above swept the ground they had to cross. And when the fighting left the cities, it often led into the forests, where the enemy set his last defensive lines among the trees. Woodland fighting is a horror of its own, the visibility short, the enemy hidden a few yards away behind trunks and undergrowth, the fighting sudden and close. Worse, the enemy learned to set his shells to burst in the branches overhead, so that the steel and splintered wood rained straight down on the men below, and lying flat on the ground gave no shelter from a blast coming from above. Cold, wet, and half-blind among the trees, you fought an enemy you often could not see until he was almost on top of you, in a place where the ground itself offered no protection from the death falling out of the canopy. And the nights, as ever, belonged to the enemy's boldest moves. The dark erased your great advantages, grounding your aircraft and blinding your gunners. And so the counterattacks and the infiltrations came in the small hours. Men slipped between your positions in the black, and the neat line held in daylight dissolved into a confusion of separate fights in the dark. You held your hold through the long, cold hours, straining your eyes at a blackness that gave you nothing, unable to tell friend from foe, firing at movement and praying. Every soldier learns that the night multiplies fear, and in the final weeks, exhausted and stretched thin across a fast-moving front, you learned it again and again. Out ahead of even the armored spearheads went the scouts, the reconnaissance men whose job was to find the enemy by driving straight at him until he shot back. In light vehicles or on foot, they ranged far in front of the main force, probing the roads and the towns, and they were the ones who sprang the ambushes, so the columns behind them would not have to. It was among the most dangerous work of the advance, to be the bait and the eyes of the army at once, to roll into a silent town, not knowing whether it was empty or full of guns. The scouts learned to read the smallest signs, the too quiet street, the missing civilians, the wrong kind of stillness, because those signs were often the only warning they would get. And someone had to be the first man into each town, the first through each door, the first around each corner, and that man carried the fear of the whole advance on his shoulders. The lead element walked into the unknown again and again, into streets that might be surrendered or might be a trap, and the man at the front had a heartbeat to react to whatever waited. Hour after hour, town after town. That role fell to one tired young man after another, and the strain of always being the first to arrive, the first the hidden gun was aimed at, wore men down in a way that is hard to describe. To live at the very point of the advance was to volunteer over and over, to find the enemy the hard way. The enemy used the land itself against you, and one of his cruelest tricks was water. Where he could, he opened the dams and the dikes and let the rivers loose across the low ground, flooding the fields and the roads you needed, turning firm earth into swamp and shallow lake. An advance that had been racing forward could bog down for days in ground the enemy had deliberately drowned, the vehicles mired, the men wading. The whole thrust stalled while the water did the defender's work for him. To find your path turned to flood by an enemy who would wreck his own country to slow you was to learn that the dying empire would spend anything, even its own land, to buy a few more days. And the enemy still fielded low, squat, armored guns, built without turrets to sit hidden and wait, and they were deadly ambushers. Dug in at the end of a street or the edge of a wood, painted and covered until they were nearly invisible, one of these could destroy the lead vehicles of a column before anyone knew where the fire was coming from. They did not charge or maneuver. They lay still, like a snake in the grass, and struck the first thing that came into range, then tried to slip away before your fire could find them. To advance into ground where one might be waiting was to know that the first warning of it would likely be the destruction of the man in front of you. The infantry that rode in the open-topped armored carriers had their own reasons to dread an ambush. These vehicles carried men forward quickly and gave some protection from the sides, but they were open to the sky and to anything that came down or over, and a single grenade or a burst of plunging fire into that open top could kill or wound everyone aboard. Packed shoulder to shoulder in a steel bathtub racing down an enemy road, you were fast, but you were a target, and the same close country that threatened the tanks threatened you. When trouble came, you had to pile out and scatter in seconds, because to stay bunched in that open box under fire was to invite disaster. The enemy had built some of the finest roads in the world, and they were a blessing and a curse both. The great highways let your columns race across the country at a speed no army had managed before, but they also funneled you into predictable paths the enemy could mine and block and cover with his guns. A fast road is only fast until it is cratered or barricaded, and then it becomes a place where a whole column bunches up, halted and exposed, while the men up front fight to clear the way. You learned that no road, however good, was ever simply safe, and that the very speed the highways offered could carry you straight into a prepared killing zone. And in the towns the fighting kept closing to a distance that no young man is ever ready for. Clearing a building meant grenades tossed through doors and around corners, a rifle fired at arm's length in a dim room, the raw and desperate struggle of men trying to kill one another in the space of a hallway. There was nothing in a young man's life before the war to prepare him for that, for violence close enough to see the other man's face, and the men who survived those rooms rarely spoke of them afterward. Each cleared building was a series of those terrible little moments, one door at a time, and there were a great many buildings between you and the end of the war. Some of the river crossings had to be made in the dark, and a night assault across water is a thing of pure nerve. You slid a small boat into cold black water and paddled toward a far shore you could not see, listening for the burst of fire that would mean you had been discovered. exposed on the open water with nowhere to go. If the enemy caught the crossing in the act, lit the water with flares and opened up, the men in those boats had almost no chance to do anything but keep going and pray. To cross a defended river at night, blind and silent, waiting for the world to come apart, asked as much of a man's courage as anything in the war, and the water itself was a killer apart from the enemy. The rivers of that late winter and early spring ran cold and fast and high with the melt, and a man weighed down with gear who went into that water from a swamped boat or a broken bridge or a fall from the bank could be pulled under and lost in moments. Men who had survived years of combat drowned in those crossings, taken not by a bullet but by the cold current, their heavy loads dragging them down. To force a river was to gamble against the water as much as against the guns on the far side, and the water showed no more mercy than the enemy did. The enemy fought a clever and destructive withdrawal, and his rearguards made you pay for the ground he gave up. As he fell back, he left small groups behind to delay you, to hold a bridge or a crossroads or a village just long enough to slow the advance, and then to slip away before they could be trapped. And he destroyed everything he could as he went, blowing bridges, cratering roads, wrecking anything that might help you follow. So the advance became a long series of these delaying fights, each one a small deadly battle over a piece of ground the enemy never meant to keep, and each one costing your men lives for terrain he would abandon by nightfall. If you are finding these stories worth your time, take a moment to subscribe, because the men who lived them are nearly gone now, and every video that keeps their memory alive is a small act of remembrance. These were young men, most of them, asked to do impossible things in the last weeks of the deadliest war in history, and the least we can do is not let what they endured be forgotten. Now let us go on, because the final push had more in store for the young man trying to survive it. One of the strangest dangers of the advance was the sheer number of the enemy surrendering, because managing that flood was a hazard in itself. On some days, your men took prisoners by the thousand, whole formations giving up at once, until the columns of the surrendered stretched back for miles and threatened to overwhelm the handful of men guarding them. A small group of your soldiers might find itself responsible for hundreds or thousands of the enemy, vastly outnumbered by the very men they had just captured, trusting that the fight had truly gone out of them. Most of the time it had, but the imbalance was real, and the danger of it, and the strain of holding that many beaten men in check while the war still raged around you, added one more weight to an already impossible situation. And the fast advance left danger in its own wake, because in racing forward, the columns bypassed pockets of the enemy who were still very much willing to fight. The tanks and trucks poured ahead down the main roads, leaving behind them, in the woods and the side valleys and the towns not yet cleared, groups of enemy soldiers who now sat squarely across your supply lines and your rear. So the ground you thought was safely behind you could erupt without warning. An ambush on a supply road, a firefight in a town you had driven through days before. The front was no longer a line but a scattered, tangled thing, and danger could come from behind you as easily as from ahead. And over all of it hung a fear that shaped the whole final campaign, the fear of a last desperate stand. Word spread that the enemy meant to gather his most fanatical forces in the mountains of the south and hold out there in a natural fortress, fighting on for months or years after the rest had fallen. Whether that fortress was real or a phantom, the fear of it was real enough to shape the advance, sending men driving hard toward the mountains to prevent it, bracing for a final bloodbath in the high country that everyone dreaded. To fight toward what you believe may be a last hopeless killing ground in the final days of a one war is a particular kind of dread, and it rode with the men through those last weeks. Moving through all of it were the medics and the aid men, doing their work in the middle of a war that never paused. In a fast advance, the wounded were a special problem because the aid stations and the hospitals struggled to keep up with a front that moved miles in a day, and a badly hurt man might have a long, rough journey back over damaged roads before he reached real care. The medics crawled to the wounded under fire, patched them as best they could, and got them started on that journey, doing the impossible with what they carried on their backs. That anyone survived serious wounds in the chaos of that advance owes much to those men. who ran toward the danger everyone else was trained to run from. And the very speed of the advance created a quieter danger, because an army racing forward can outrun the supplies that keep it alive. Fuel, food, and ammunition all had to be hauled ever greater distances over roads the enemy had done his best to wreck. And when the supply lines stretched too thin, the spearheads at the front went short at the worst possible moments. A tank with no fuel is a steel box in a field. A soldier with no ammunition is a man with a club. To drive deep into enemy country was to risk finding yourself far ahead of everything you needed, in hostile ground waiting for supplies that were struggling to reach you. And the enemy understood that weakness and struck at it where he could. And through it all, the plain daily grind of the advance wore the men down to the bone. There was little sleep, snatched in ruined buildings and roadside ditches. There was cold and wet and mud and food eaten cold on the move. There was the endless marching and riding and digging day after day, with no true rest and no end date a man could count on. The body can run on adrenaline and will for a long time, but not forever, and men grew gaunt and slow and hollow-eyed, moving through the final weeks on sheer momentum. A worn-out soldier makes the small mistakes that get him killed, and by the end, nearly everyone was worn out. And yet the advance rolled on and demanded more. And the strain on the mind grew stranger the closer the end came. Men who had been steady for years developed superstitions, small rituals they believed kept them alive, a growing certainty that their luck was a finite thing that could run out at any moment. They counted, always counted, the days the war might have left, the friends still standing, the odds of making it through one more fight. And they learned hard not to grow too close to the new men, because the new men so often did not last, and there was only so much loss a heart could take. To live suspended between the hope of home and the dread of falling at the finish line was its own slow torment, and it marked every man who carried it. And as the advance rolled deeper, the war began to take on the shape of an occupation, which brought its own uneasy dangers. Town after town fell, white sheets hanging from the windows, and the soldiers found themselves not just fighting an enemy, but moving among a defeated people, a whole population that had to be watched, controlled, and passed through. Most of them wanted only for the war to end. But you could never be entirely sure which quiet face hid a last fanatic, which cellar held a hidden weapon, which friendly gesture masked a final act of resistance. To move as a conqueror through a beaten land, never quite able to relax, watching the very people whose towns you now held, was a tense and wearing way to spend those final weeks. And there was the strange, dawning awareness that another great army was closing in from the opposite direction. As you drove east, your allies drove west, and between you, the dying empire was being crushed to nothing, the ring drawing tighter every day. Somewhere ahead, the two advances would meet, and the war in the middle of that continent would be finished. That knowledge gave the final push a peculiar feeling, the sense of a noose pulling shut, of an ending rushing toward you from both sides at once. But knowing the end was close did nothing to make the last miles safe, and men kept falling in the shrinking space between the two armies right up until the moment they finally met. And you carried, through all of it, the weight of the friends you lost, made almost unbearable by how near the end had come. To lose a man now, with the enemy collapsing and home so close you could taste it, was a grief with a special cruelty in it, an unfairness that cut deeper than any earlier loss. These were men who had come so far, survived so much, earned their way home a dozen times over, and the war took them anyway, in the final miles, for nothing anyone could name. The men who lived carried those last losses hardest of all, along with the quiet, unanswerable question that would follow them the rest of their lives, of why it had been that man, and not them. And as the advance overran the places where the regime had held its victims, a heavy responsibility fell suddenly onto ordinary soldiers, the care of the survivors they found. Men trained to fight now found themselves trying to help people who had been starved and broken almost beyond saving, with no supplies meant for such a thing and no training for what they were seeing. They shared their rations, called for aid, did what little they could, and learned the hard way that people in that condition could not simply be fed back to health, that some were beyond any help that came too late. It was a duty no soldier had been prepared for, and the men who carried it out carried the memory of it forever. For the wounded of the fast advance, salvation sometimes came from the sky in the form of small, light aircraft that could land almost anywhere. Where the roads back were long or cut, these little planes could put down on a field or a stretch of road near the front, take aboard a badly hurt man, and fly him to a hospital in a fraction of the time a truck would need. It was a lifeline for those whose wounds could not wait, and it saved men who would otherwise have died on the long, jolting journey to the rear. But the planes were few, and the wounded were many, and most still faced the hard road back, so a place on one of those small aircraft could be the difference between living and dying. And someone had to tend to the dead, which was its own grim and unending labor. Amid the advance, the men whose task it was gathered the fallen, recorded who they were, and saw them buried, so that no soldier would simply vanish into the ruins of a foreign country. It was quiet, somber, heartbreaking work, carried out in the wake of every fight, and it never stopped, because the fighting never stopped producing more. To handle the dead of your own side day after day, to see the faces and read the names and dig the graves, marked those men as surely as combat marked anyone, and it was one more of the war's countless burdens the world back home rarely saw. There was a strange, unsettling feeling to fighting inside the enemy's own homeland at last, after so many years and so many miles. This was the heart of the empire that had set the world on fire, and now you walked its streets and slept in its houses and moved among its people, and it did not look like the monster you had imagined. It looked like ordinary towns and ordinary farms and ordinary frightened families, and yet you knew what had come out of this place, and you had seen or would see the proof of it. To carry both of those truths at once, the ordinary human faces and the terrible thing they had served, was a weight on the mind that many men never fully set down. And you learned to distrust even the ordinary comforts a soldier scavenges, because the enemy left traps in them too. A bottle of drink left behind, a cache of food, a well, or a pump. Any of them might be poisoned or wired to kill the tired, hungry men who reached for them. So you learned to take nothing for granted, to suspect the smallest gift the ruined country seemed to offer, because the dying regime's malice reached even into the simple human wish for a drink of clean water or a bite of something warm. To be unable to trust even the water and the food around you was one more grinding strain in a campaign already full of them. As the end drew unmistakably near, a strange change came over the men, a deep and desperate caution born of being so close to home. Soldiers who had taken every risk for years now weighed each one, unwilling to be the last to fall, and no one could blame them. The thought of surviving the whole war only to die in its final hours was almost too much to bear, and it made the last fights in a way the hardest of all, because now every man had something to lose that he could almost hold in his hands. To ask a man to charge a gun on the last morning of a war he had already won is to ask something that goes against every instinct, and yet it was still asked and still done. And yet the opposite danger lurked too, because as the enemy collapsed and the towns fell without a fight, it became easy to grow careless, to relax the hard-won caution that had kept you alive. A string of quiet days, of easy surrenders, could lull a column into dropping its guard, and that was exactly when a hidden gun or a last fanatic could exact a terrible toll. The men who survived the final weeks were the ones who somehow held their vigilance even as everything told them the danger was passing, because the war had a cruel habit of striking hardest at the moment men let themselves believe it was over. The roads were choked not only with the freed and the surrendered, but with civilians in flight, great columns of the enemy's own people fleeing westward, many of them running from the other army closing in from the far side and desperate to give themselves up to your forces instead. This human tide clogged every route, slowed every advance, and turned the roads into rivers of frightened, exhausted people pushing carts and carrying children. For the soldier, it was a heartbreaking obstacle and a constant confusion. One more thing to see and to move through and to carry in memory, the sight of a whole population uprooted and fleeing in the last days of the war their leaders had begun. And a heavy burden fell on the young men who led the small units, the lieutenants and the sergeants who had to make the life and death choices at every town and every crossroads. They were often barely older than the men they led, and they carried the weight of deciding who went first, who took the risk, when to push and when to hold. knowing that a wrong call could cost the lives of men they had come to love like brothers. To lead from the front in the final weeks, to be the one who ordered the advance into the unknown and then went first yourself, aged these young leaders beyond their years, and many of them fell doing it, because leading in that war meant being where the danger was greatest, and the enemy was not finished throwing punches, even at the end. Now and then, out of a front that seemed to be dissolving, would come a sudden, fierce counterattack, a last gathering of tanks and fanatical infantry, striking hard at a point they thought weak, trying to throw the advance back or buy time no one on their side could really use. These blows could catch a tired, overextended column badly, and the fighting to beat them off was as sharp as anything earlier in the war. To be hit by a determined attack in the war's last days, when you thought the enemy had nothing left, was a shock that killed men who had let themselves believe the fighting was nearly done. And moving among the men were the chaplains, doing what they could for souls worn ragged by too much death. They held brief services in ruined churches and muddy fields, sat with the dying, wrote to the families of the fallen, and offered what comfort could be found in a place with little of it. In the final weeks, with men falling so close to the end, that comfort mattered more than ever, and the chaplains spent themselves giving it, often sharing the same dangers as the men they served. Faith, or simple human kindness, was one of the few shelters left to men in that storm, and those who carried it forward walked the same deadly roads as everyone else. By this point in the war, the men who had lasted the longest often carried a strange, quiet fatalism, a sense that they had used up more luck than any man was owed, and that the account would come due. They had watched too many friends fall, seen too many close calls, to believe fully in their own survival, and so they went forward each day with a grim, worn steadiness, doing the job because it had to be done, half expecting each fight to be the one. That fatalism was not despair exactly. It was something harder and sadder, the calm of men who had made their peace with the odds, and it was one of the marks the war left on those who endured it longest. And out at the very front, often ahead of the infantry, went the men who directed the artillery, the forward observers, whose job was to see the enemy and call the great guns down onto him. To do that, they had to be where they could see, which meant the most exposed positions of all, a church tower, a forward ridge, the top floor of a building under fire. They were prime targets because the enemy knew that killing the man who directed the guns blinded them, and so the observers lived in the most dangerous seats on the battlefield. But the fire they called was often what broke up the enemy's attacks and cleared the way forward, and the men on the ground owed more than they knew to those exposed eyes out front. And behind the fighting machines came the men who kept them alive, the mechanics and the recovery crews who worked to drag damaged tanks out of the fire and patch them back into the fight. A broken down or bogged tank in the middle of an advance was a crisis, and getting it moving again or hauling it clear often meant working in the open, under fire on a machine the enemy was still trying to destroy. These men were not supposed to be in the thick of the fighting, and yet the demands of the advance put them there again and again, laboring on stricken vehicles, while the battle raged around them, because an army that runs on machines runs also on the men who keep those machines alive. And when the radios failed, as they often did in the chaos and the ruins, the army fell back on men to carry its messages, and to be a runner in that fighting was to take on one of the deadliest tasks of all. A message that had to reach a forward position might mean a man sprinting across open ground swept by fire, from cover to cover, carrying words that could not wait. The runner had no weapon that could help him, only his speed and his luck. And he made that crossing knowing the enemy would fire at any moving figure. Communication is the nervous system of an army, and in the close, confused fighting of the final push, it often came down to a single brave man running through the fire to keep the units talking to one another. And the flood of the enemy did not stop at the fighting men, because among the surrendered and the overrun were great numbers of enemy wounded, and caring for them fell partly to you. Your own medics and doctors, already overwhelmed, now had to treat the men who had been trying to kill them hours before, because that is what the rules of war and simple decency demanded. It was a strange, hard thing to bind the wounds of the enemy while your own friends still lay hurt, and it added yet another weight to an already staggering load, but it was done. because the alternative was to become the very thing you had crossed an ocean to destroy. And now and then, through all the chaos of the advance, the mail from home caught up with you, and for a few minutes it carried you somewhere else. A letter, folded and travel-worn, full of ordinary news from a world that had kept turning without you, a world of front porches and family suppers and quiet streets under a peaceful sky. You read it in a ruined building in an enemy land, and for a moment you were home, whole and safe, and then the letter was folded away, and the war was still there all around you. That gap between the world in the letter and the world you were living in was almost too wide to bear, and the nearness of the end only made the ache of it sharper, because home had never felt so close and so impossibly far at the same time. So here, at the close of this second part, understand where you stand. You have raced across the heartland at the tip of the spear. You have crossed river after river under fire, squeezed shut the great pocket, fought through the ruins and the forests and the long cold nights, watched the prisoners surrender in their thousands, even as the fanatics fought to the death. You are worn to nothing, and the end is closer than ever, and that closeness has become its own kind of danger. But the dying empire has one last strange chapter left to give, and its final days hold dangers stranger still than anything you have faced so far. That is where this story goes next. Subscribe and stay with us, because the last hours of the war against the German dictator were not the safe, quiet ending anyone hoped for, and the men who lived them earned every step of the way home. You have come so far now that you can almost hear the end of the war in the distance, a strange thinning of the guns, a sense of something enormous drawing to a close. But you are not home yet, and the last stretch of any long and terrible road is often the cruelest, because the ground is littered with the men who let themselves relax too soon. In the first two parts of this story, we watched the beaten enemy fight from the rubble, and we followed you deep into the dying heartland at the very tip of the spear. Now we come to the end itself, to the final days and hours of the war against the German dictator, and to the last strange dangers a young man had to survive before he could finally turn for home. The finish line is in sight at last, and that is exactly what makes these final steps so deadly. There is a peculiar feeling in the air as a great war winds down, and every man on that front felt it. The fighting grew patchy and uneven, fierce in one place and utterly silent in another, and the old certainties dissolved into a strange, tense confusion. You could pass through a town that surrendered without a shot and, an hour later, run headlong into a firefight as vicious as any in the whole war. The enemy was collapsing. Everyone could see it. And yet the collapse was not clean or orderly, and a man never quite knew from 1 hour to the next whether he was walking into peace or into one last patch of hell. That uncertainty, at the very end, was a torment all its own. By now the enemy had been driven back to his last natural barriers, and one more great river lay across your path, a final waterline before the last of the heartland. Like every river before it, this one had to be forced, its bridges blown, its far bank defended by whatever the enemy could still scrape together. But there was something different about this crossing, because everyone knew it was among the last, that beyond it the enemy had almost nothing left, that the men who fell forcing this water might be among the final casualties of the whole war in the West. To risk everything at the second to last hurdle, with the finish so near, took a courage that is hard to fathom, and the men found it, because the river had to be crossed and there was no one else to cross it. The enemy blew the last of his bridges as he fell back, determined to make you pay for every final mile, so once again the crossings came down to small boats and hasty spans thrown up under fire. There is a special cruelty in dying at a river crossing in the last days of a war, exposed on open water with the far bank spitting fire. And yet men did, because the water would not cross itself and the advance could not wait. The engineers labored on those final bridges as they had on all the others, in the open, under whatever the enemy had left to throw. And the men who forced those last rivers earned their place among the bravest of the whole long campaign, crossing into the teeth of an enemy who was beaten but not yet finished. And as you pushed on, you began to feel the presence of another great army pushing toward you from the opposite direction, the ally that had fought its own long and brutal road across the continent from the far side. The dying empire was being crushed between two advancing forces, the space in the middle shrinking day by day, until only a narrow band of enemy-held ground remained between them. There was a strange electricity to that knowledge, the sense that the war in the middle of the continent was about to be squeezed out of existence entirely. But the closing of that gap was paid for in blood right to the end, because the enemy trapped in the middle still had to be fought, and men kept falling in that shrinking space until the two armies finally touched. When the two advances at last met, when the soldiers of the two great armies came face to face in the middle of the ruined enemy heartland, it was a moment that told everyone the end had truly come. The enemy who had stood between them was finished, split in two, with no room left to maneuver and nowhere left to run. For the men who were there, that meeting was a strange and powerful thing, a joining of two long and terrible journeys begun at opposite ends of the earth. And it meant, more than any announcement could, that the war in this place was very nearly over. But even then, the guns had not fallen silent, and the last, most bitter irony of the war was still playing out in the pockets that had not yet given up. For even now, with the country cut in two and the end plainly in sight, some places still had to be taken the hard way. A last great city, a final fortress, a strong point held by men who would not surrender. Each of these still had to be fought for, street by street, room by room, at the usual terrible cost. The men sent to reduce these final holdouts had the cruelest job of all, to die taking ground in the last days of a war whose outcome no one doubted anymore. There is no sacrifice harder to understand than the one made at the very end, for an objective everyone knows is already lost to the enemy, and yet those objectives had to be taken, and men gave their lives to take them, right up to the final hours. And the patrols still went out, even in those last days, small groups of men sent forward into the unknown to find out whether the ground ahead was held or clear. To walk point on one of those final patrols, knowing the war might end tomorrow, knowing that this quiet lane might hold the last machine gun of the whole conflict, asked a kind of nerve that grew harder, not easier as the end approached. A firefight in the last week of the war was every bit as deadly as one in the first, and the men caught in those final skirmishes died just as surely, in a war that everyone knew was already won. There was no glory left to be had in it, only the grim necessity of finding out what still waited in the next town. Part of what made those last fights so dangerous was the enemy who kept fighting even when all was clearly lost, and there were several kinds of him. Some fought on out of fanatic loyalty to a cause already dead. Some fought because they feared what would happen to them if they surrendered, having been told terrible lies about the fate that awaited prisoners. And some fought simply because no order to stop had reached them, isolated and cut off in the chaos of a collapsing front. Whatever the reason, the result was the same for the men facing them, an enemy still willing to kill and die in the final hours, in scattered, unpredictable pockets that could turn a quiet advance deadly without a moment's warning. And then word began to spread through the ranks that the very top of the enemy's world had collapsed, that the leadership was crumbling, that the German dictator himself was dead. The empire that had seemed so vast and so terrible only a few years before was dissolving from the head down, its cities in ruins, its armies shattered, its leader gone. For the men who had crossed an ocean and fought for years to bring about exactly this, the news was met not with wild celebration, but often with a weary, wary disbelief, because they had learned the hard way not to trust in an ending until it truly arrived. The beast was dying, its head was struck off, and yet, in scattered places, the body still twitched and still killed, and the men knew better than to lower their guard. The final days became a chaos of rumor and hope and dread all tangled together. Word raced up and down the front that the end was hours away, that a surrender was being signed, that the killing was about to stop, and each rumor made the men both hopeful and terrified, because now, more than ever, no one wanted to be the last to die. Some units were still fighting hard, while others, a few miles away, were already accepting the surrender of whole enemy formations. In that confusion, a man might be told the war was over, even as, over the next hill, it was still very much on, and the dread of catching a final bullet in the last uncertain hours hung over everyone like a shadow. And in the confusion, the word did not reach everyone at once, which led to some of the saddest deaths of the whole war. A ceasefire agreed at a table far away took time to travel down to every scattered outpost and isolated patrol, and in that gap, men on both sides who had not yet heard the news went on fighting and dying for a war that was, on paper, already over. To fall in those hours, killed in a fight that both sides had technically already ended simply because the word had not yet arrived, is among the cruelest fates the war dealt anyone, and it happened because a message cannot travel faster than it can travel, and the guns did not know to stop until someone told them, and someone was the last. In every war there is a final casualty, a man who falls in the last hour, or the last minute, of the fighting after surviving everything that came before, and the thought of it haunted every soldier on that front. To have come so far, through the beaches or the mountains or the long grinding advance, through years of everything the war could throw at a man, and then to fall in the final moments with peace so close you could almost touch it, was the cruelest fate the war could deal. The men who fell in those last days and hours were mourned with a special grief because their loss carried an unfairness so sharp it could hardly be borne, and their friends would carry the memory of it forever. And the big guns kept firing nearly to the end. Even a collapsing army had artillery, and it used it, and even your own guns were still dropping fire onto the last holdouts in the final hours. To be killed by a shell in the last days of the war, when the outcome was certain and the peace was almost signed, was a death as meaningless as any in the whole conflict, and yet the shells did not know the war was ending. They fell as they had always fallen, out of a sky that gave no warning, and men who had survived years of bombardment were taken in the final barrages of a war that was all but over. The thunder did not stop until it was told to, and the telling came too late for some. But mostly in those final days, the enemy was giving up, and giving up in numbers beyond counting. White flags hung from every window, whole units marched into captivity with something like relief, and the roads filled with endless columns of the surrendered. Men who had had enough, who wanted nothing now but for the nightmare to end and to go home to whatever was left of their own lives. The great war machine that had terrorized a continent was laying down its arms, unit by unit, town by town, until the trickle of surrenders became a flood, and it was clear to everyone that the end was no longer a question of if, but of hours. The scale of the surrender was almost impossible to grasp. Enemy soldiers gave themselves up not in the hundreds, but in the hundreds of thousands, whole armies dissolving into long, shuffling columns of prisoners that stretched beyond the horizon, so many that your men could scarcely guard or feed or house them all. To stand and watch an entire army lay down its weapons, the same army that had held a continent in its grip, was to witness something that few soldiers in history have ever seen: the complete and total collapse of an enemy who had once seemed invincible. And still, even in that flood of surrender, a careful man kept his guard up, because among the many who had truly given up, there could always be the one who had not. At the highest level, the surrender was made formal, the enemy's commanders coming forward to lay down the arms of entire armies, and even that moment carried a thread of tension. To sit across from the men who had directed so much death, to accept the surrender of an enemy who days before had been trying to kill you, was a strange and heavy thing, and no one fully relaxed until the papers were signed and the word had truly gone out. For the ordinary soldier, far from those tables, the formal surrender was something he heard about rather than saw, but it was the thing that finally, officially, ended the war he had been fighting, and its signing was the hinge on which his whole future turned. And out on the roads, the great columns of tanks and trucks that had raced across the country for weeks simply rolled to a halt, their long advance finally over. The engines that had carried the army deep into the heartland fell quiet, the crews climbed down, and men who had been in constant motion for so long stood still at last on the ground they had won. There was something almost unreal about it, the sudden stopping of a machine that had been driving forward with such force for so long, and the men felt it, the strange stillness of an advance that had finally reached its end, with no more ground ahead that needed taking. And in the quiet, the men began to do a painful arithmetic, counting up who was left from the group they had started with. So many faces were gone, lost along the way, that in some units barely a handful of the original men remained, the rest killed, wounded, or worn out, and sent back over the long months of fighting. To look around at the end and see how few were left from the ones who had begun the journey was a sobering, sorrowful thing, a measure of the true cost of what they had done. The survivors carried not only their own memories, but the memory of all the others, the many who had started the road with them and had not lived to see its end. And as the advance overran the last of the ground the regime had held, more of its hidden horrors and more of its captives came to light. Camps were liberated in the final days, their surviving prisoners freed, and among them were soldiers of your own side who had been held for months or years, now suddenly delivered as your men broke through. To free those prisoners, to reach them before the collapsing enemy could move or harm them, was one of the few unshadowed joys of the end, but it also meant more evidence of what this war had truly been about, more proof of why the long fight had mattered. The men who opened those final gates carried away both the joy of the rescue and the weight of what they saw, mingled together as so much of this war's ending was. If this story has stayed with you all the way to its end, take a moment now to subscribe and to share it with someone who still remembers, because the men who lived through these final days are very nearly gone, and every telling of what they endured is a small stand against forgetting. What they carried through those last hours, so close to home and still in danger, deserves to be remembered for as long as anyone will listen. Now let us go to the moment they had fought so long to reach, and then at last it came. The word passed down the line that it was over, that the enemy had surrendered, that the guns were to fall silent. In some places it arrived as a formal announcement, in others as a strange and sudden quiet, where the shooting simply stopped and did not begin again. The men who had lived so long inside the constant noise of war found themselves standing in a silence they had almost forgotten existed, a silence so complete and so strange that many could scarcely believe it was real. The war against the German dictator, the war that had swallowed years of their lives and the lives of so many friends, was finished. It was over, and for a long moment, many of the men simply could not take it in. There was no single way that men greeted that silence. Some cheered and wept and fired their weapons into the air in wild relief. But many others could not celebrate at all, could only sit down where they stood, hollow and numb, staring at nothing, too worn and too full of loss to feel any joy. They thought of the friends who had not lived to see this moment, the men who had fallen days or hours before the end, the faces that should have been there beside them and were not. For men who had lost so much and endured so long, the end of the war was not a simple happiness. It was a vast and complicated thing, relief and grief and exhaustion and disbelief all at once. And it settled over them in a way they would never fully be able to put into words. For a great many of the men, the overwhelming feeling at the end was not joy, but a deep and total exhaustion, a weariness so complete that it left little room for anything else. They had been afraid for so long, keyed up for so long, running on nerve for so long, that when the pressure finally lifted, what remained was not celebration, but a kind of hollow collapse, the sudden draining away of everything that had kept them going. Some men slept for a day and more once it was safe to sleep. Others simply sat, quiet and empty, letting the reality settle over them slowly. The body and the mind, held so tight for so long, needed time to understand that the danger had truly passed. And there came a first night when a man could lie down and sleep without fear. The first such night in longer than he could remember, and it was a stranger feeling than anyone expects. For months, for years, part of the mind had stayed on watch even in sleep, listening for the enemy, ready to wake to danger in an instant. Now suddenly there was no danger to listen for, and yet the habit did not release its grip easily. Many men found they could not fully relax even in safety, that their bodies did not know how to stand down after being braced for so long. Learning to sleep again, to truly rest, to trust the quiet, was one of the first small battles of the peace, and for some it took a very long time. And the end of the fighting did not empty the hospitals, which stayed full of the men wounded in the final weeks, some of whom would go on fighting their own private battles for life and limb long after the guns fell silent. A wound did not heal any faster because the war was over, and the surgeons and nurses worked on, saving whom they could, easing the passing of those they could not. Men died of their wounds in the days and weeks after the surrender, slipping away in hospital beds while the rest of the world celebrated peace. And for their families, The telegram came just the same, the war having claimed them after it had officially ended. The cost of those final battles went on being paid long after the shooting stopped. And here is a cruelty few expect, that men kept dying even after the guns were meant to be silent. In the wild celebrations, weapons fired into the air sent bullets falling back to earth. In the ruined landscape, mines and unexploded shells still waited for a careless step. On the roads, exhausted men and fast vehicles met with fatal results. To survive the entire war and then to die in an accident in the first days of peace was a bitter, senseless end, and it happened, because the dangers the war had created did not vanish the moment it was declared over. The land itself remained deadly, and the sudden relaxation of men who had been tense for years brought its own risks, and peace, it turned out, had a body count of its own. Nor did the danger from the enemy vanish entirely with the surrender. There were still, in the shadows, the fanatics who had been told to keep fighting as secret killers even after their armies laid down their arms, and for a time the fear of them lingered. A shot from a window in an occupied town, an ambush on a lonely road, kept the men on edge even after the official end, unwilling to fully believe they were safe. It took time for that fear to fade, for the men to trust that the killing was truly over, and in the meantime, they moved through their victory with one eye still on the windows and the tree lines, because the habits that had kept them alive did not switch off simply because a surrender had been signed. And the ruined land they had conquered remained a dangerous place long after the shooting stopped. The wreckage of war lay everywhere, unexploded bombs and shells buried in the rubble, minefields not yet cleared, ruined buildings ready to collapse. Disease stalked the crowded, hungry, displaced masses, and the threat of epidemic hung over a continent full of the uprooted and the starving. The men who had won the war now moved through its wreckage, and the wreckage could still kill slowly or suddenly in 100 quiet ways. Victory did not make the land safe. It only ended the deliberate killing and left behind a ruined world that would take years and more lives to make whole again. And when the men lifted their eyes from that first strange silence, they looked out on what the war had left behind, and the sight of it was staggering. Cities reduced to endless seas of rubble, a whole country in ruins, roads choked with millions of the displaced and the freed and the surrendered, a continent full of people uprooted and wandering, hungry and lost. They had won, but they had won a wasteland, and the scale of the ruin was almost impossible to take in. The task of putting even a fraction of it right would fall to many of these same men in the days and months ahead, and the war's end, far from being a clean finish, was in many ways the beginning of a long, hard reckoning with everything the war had destroyed. With the fighting over, the men found themselves handed a strange new job, the governing of a conquered land, and it was an uneasy role for soldiers trained only to fight. They guarded, they patrolled, they kept order in ruined towns full of hungry, frightened, defeated people, and they did it while still half expecting a shot from a window that mostly never came. To go overnight from fighting a people to policing them, to shift from destroying an enemy to feeding and managing him, asked a strange flexibility of young men who had known only war, and they carried it out as best they could, in a land where the old order had collapsed and a new one had not yet risen. And moving among the defeated people brought its own quiet strangeness. These were the men, women, and children of the country that had set the world aflame, and now they stood in the ruins of their cities, hungry and beaten, no longer an enemy to be fought but a people to be dealt with. Most wanted only to survive, to find food, to put their shattered lives back together. The soldiers felt a tangle of things looking at them: anger for what their nation had done, pity for their suffering, wariness of the last few who might still mean harm, and a simple human recognition of other people caught in the wreckage of a catastrophe. It was a complicated piece, lived out face to face with the people on the other side of the war. And in the quiet after, many of the men were visited by a question that had no answer, the question of why they had lived when so many better men had not. They carried photographs of friends who had not made it, letters never finished, memories of the ones who had fallen beside them, and they wondered in the long nights what made them the ones who walked away. There is a particular weight to surviving when others did not, a guilt that has nothing to do with anything a man did wrong, and it settled onto many of these men and stayed. They would carry the faces of the lost for the rest of their lives, along with the unanswerable question of why it had been those men and not themselves. And it is worth remembering at the end just how young most of these men were. Boys, many of them, who had gone off to war before they were old enough to have truly begun their lives, and who now stood in the ruins of a foreign country, having seen and done things no one should ever have to. The war had taken their youth and spent it, and handed back experiences no young person should carry, and they would go home older than their years, changed in ways their families would struggle to understand. Whatever else the war cost them, it cost them that, the ordinary young manhood they never got to have, traded away for the survival of a world that would never fully know what they had given. And for many of the men, the end of this war did not even mean going home, which was a bitter thing to learn in the very hour of victory. Because on the far side of the world another war was still raging, and word came that some of them, having survived everything this one had thrown at them, might soon be sent to fight in that one too. To have crossed an ocean, fought across a continent, survived years of hell, only to be told that home was still not certain, that another invasion of another enemy might yet be waiting, was a cruel weight to carry in the moment that should have been pure relief. The war against the German dictator was over, but for a great many of these men, the fighting and the fear was not yet done. And even for those who would go home, home did not come quickly. There were not enough ships, and the vast machinery that had carried an army across the ocean now had to carry it back a piece at a time, so men waited sometimes for months in a strange limbo between war and peace, their fighting done, but their return not yet come. They sat in camps in the ruined country they had conquered, thinking of home, counting the days once again, this time toward a ship instead of away from a bullet. The waiting was its own quiet trial, the hardest kind of patience, so close to the end of it all, and yet still an ocean away from the people and the lives they had left behind so long ago. And somewhere in those days, most of them found a quiet moment to write the letter they had wondered, for years, whether they would ever get to write. A short letter, often, saying simply that it was over, that they had made it, that they were coming home. For the families who received those letters, after months and years of dread, of watching the mail and the front door, of fearing the worst with every knock, those few plain words were everything. And for the men who wrote them, setting down at last that they had survived, there was a feeling almost too large to hold, the sudden, staggering reality that they had lived, that the war was behind them, that against all the odds this story had told, they were still here to write it, and every man who walked out of that war carried a cost that no one back home would ever fully see. The friends lost, whose faces would visit them in quiet moments for the rest of their lives. The things seen that could never be unseen. The nerves worn raw by years of fear. The sleep that would never again come easy. The sudden flinch at a loud noise decades later. They came home changed, most of them, in ways they could rarely put into words, and they carried the war inside them, quietly, for the rest of their long lives. Victory did not undo any of that. The men who survived paid for their survival in a currency they would go on paying for as long as they lived. Those were wounds that no medal could heal and no homecoming could erase, and for the most part, the men bore them in silence. They did not speak much of what they had seen and done, not to their families, often not to anyone, and they carried it alone, as their generation was taught to do. They built lives, raised children, went to work, and looked to the world like ordinary men. But inside, many of them carried the beaches and the rivers and the ruined cities and the faces of the friends they had left behind, all the way to the end of their days. The war did not end for them when the guns fell silent. In a quiet, private way, it never fully ended at all. For the men who had been in it from the early days, that final silence was the end of a road years long, the culmination of everything they had survived. Some had landed on the first beaches, fought through the first hard winters, crossed a whole continent of battlefields to reach this ending. To have endured all of it, from the beginning to the very end, and to still be standing when the guns fell silent, was a thing almost too large to comprehend. They had seen the war at its worst and outlasted it, and now it was over, and they were among the ones who had made it through the entire long ordeal, carrying the whole weight of it with them into whatever came next. And it took time, sometimes a great deal of time, to truly believe that the danger was gone. Men who had spent years learning to watch every window, to distrust every open field, to brace for the next shell did not simply shed those habits because a surrender had been signed. For a while they still flinched, still watched, still felt the old tension coil in their chests at a sudden sound. Slowly the reflexes eased, and the safety became real to them, and they learned again what it was to walk down a road without fear. But some part of that hard-won wariness stayed with many of them always, a permanent mark of the years when staying alive had meant never letting your guard down. And when the mail caught up with them now, it carried a different weight, because the letters from home no longer had to fear the worst. Now the families wrote knowing their sons and husbands and brothers had survived, and the men read those letters knowing they would live to come home and answer them in person. After years of correspondence shadowed by the fear that any letter might be the last, that simple change, the lifting of the dread, was almost overwhelming. The ordinary words from home that had once been a fragile lifeline across a deadly distance were now a bridge back to a life the men could finally believe they would return to. And there was a strange truth in those final days that many of the men came to see, that the enemy soldiers, for the most part, were as relieved as anyone that it was over. The ordinary men on the other side, the ones who surrendered in their hundreds of thousands, were exhausted and beaten and glad in the end, simply to have survived. Glad that the killing had stopped, glad to be going home if home still stood. Stripped of the cause that had driven them, they were revealed as what they had been all along. Young men caught in a catastrophe their leaders had made, wanting the same thing your men wanted, for the war to end and to live. In that shared relief, at the very end, there was a small and sober reminder of the common humanity the war had done its best to bury. And a new anxiety crept in among the men, the question of who would go home first and when. A system of points decided the order, rewarding those who had served longest and suffered most, and men counted their points as anxiously as they had once counted the days of a tour, watching to see whether they had enough to be sent home, or whether they would have to wait, or worse, be sent on to the other war still raging across the world, to have survived, and then to wait in uncertainty for the ship that would carry you home, not knowing how long the waiting would last, was a strange, suspended way to live out the first weeks of a peace so hard won. And slowly, the small ordinary things of life began to return, and they felt like small miracles. A hot meal that was not eaten cold from a can on the move, a real bed, or something close to one after months of holes in the ground and floors of ruined houses, a night's sleep that no one interrupted, a wash, dry clothes, a quiet hour with nothing trying to kill you. The men had gone so long without these simple comforts that having them back again was almost overwhelming, a reminder of the ordinary human life the war had taken from them, and a first small step back toward the world they had left behind so very long ago. And already, in those first weeks, the men began to sense a distance that would follow them home, the knowledge that the people who loved them could never fully understand where they had been. How do you explain the beaches, the rivers, the ruined cities, the friends lost, the things seen behind those gates, to someone who spent the war in an ordinary town under a peaceful sky? Most of the men understood, without being told, that they would not even try, that they would carry it quietly and let their families believe they had come home whole. That silence began at the very end of the war, in the first days of peace, and for many of these men it would last the rest of their lives. So let us finally answer, for the last time, the question we began with. Why wouldn't you survive the war against the German dictator, and above all its terrible final chapter? Not because you are weak, and not because you lack courage. You would not survive because a dying empire is the most dangerous kind, and this one fought to the very end with everything it had. It made you cross river after river under fire. It made you clear its ruined cities room by room, with a weapon in every window and a trap in every doorway. It threw its fanatics and its old men and its children into your path, murdered its own to keep the fight alive, seeded the ground with patient killers, and drowned its own land to slow you down. And over all of it, in those final weeks, hung the cruelest weight of all, the knowledge that the end was near, that to fall now was to fall for nothing, and that someone had to be the last to die. And yet, Here is the part that should stay with you longest, now that you have followed this story all the way to its end. Men did survive, not because the odds spared them, but because they endured what should not have been endurable, right up to the final silence. They crossed the last rivers. They cleared the last cities. They took the last strongpoints that everyone knew were already lost. They held their nerve through the chaos of the final days, when a single wrong step could have cost them everything with peace so close at hand. They opened the gates on the worst that human beings have ever done, and they did not turn away. And when the guns at last fell silent, they carried their fallen friends in their hearts and turned finally toward home. When you weigh everything this war threw at them, from the first beach to the final silence, the wonder is not how many were lost. The wonder is that any of them made it through at all. That is why these stories matter, and that is why we have told this one all the way to its end. The men who lived it are old now, and their number grows smaller every single year, and each of them carried this war home and lived with it, quietly, for the whole of their long lives, in ways most of us will never have to imagine. The least we can do is remember what they walked into on our behalf, from the first day to the last. So if this story has stayed with you, do these small things before you go. Subscribe so the next one finds you. Share it with someone who still remembers, and take a moment sometime to thank the ones who are still with us, while there is still time to do it. Our story that is remembered is a life that is honored, and these are lives that deserve to be honored for as long as there is anyone left to listen. And so it ends where it had to end, in silence. The guns are quiet at last. The dying empire is finished, its dictator gone, its armies laid down, its terror ended. And you are still standing. You crossed the rivers, cleared the cities, survived the desperate final weeks when the beast was at its most dangerous, and lived to see the strange, unbelievable quiet of the war's last day. Around you, some men cheer, and some men weep, and some men only sit, staring, unable to believe it is real. You think of the friends who did not make it, the ones who fell so close to this moment they could almost have touched it, and you carry them with you, as you will for the rest of your life. The war against the German dictator is over. And out here in this vast and sudden silence, still breathing, still standing, that is as close to a victory as anyone ever gets.